Thank you, RJ. This is a very nice crowd. I apologize to all of you who thought Larry Adams was speaking today. There was some confusion. I apologize for this stain on my shirt. I realized it when I got here, but I decided it would represent the stain of anti-Semitism, but every shirt in my closet reflects the stain of anti-Semitism. I just want to make it clear before we begin that my presentation today really has not changed significantly from what it would have been a month ago. I know there are some serious political issues. I know we're all troubled by what's going on in the Mideast, and I'm willing to talk about that, but not during this presentation. But I will host a little bit of a talk back if people want to share their feelings about that important issue. So just keep that in mind. My name is Dick Wolfsie. That is not my real name. It was probably bungled and mumbled by my grandfather or my great-grandfather and misunderstood by the gentleman at Ellis Island. I am a Jew, and I use that word proudly, but one of the things I'm going to talk about today is how that word has come to be derisive, how people hear it the wrong way. Anchors, if you listen to anchors on TV, they'll tell you a Christian did this or a Christian did that, but they'll never say a Jew did that. It just has a ring to it, a connotation. And I sort of sometimes feel the same way when I hear somebody say that. And that's obviously wrong, because obviously a Jew is a perfectly good word. I used that word as a premise for the first joke, if you can call it a joke, that I did when I did Fringe 5 years ago. For those who don't know, Fringe is a group of actors and actresses from all over the country who come to Indianapolis to share their talent. And my thing was Jewish humor. It was a 55-minute presentation where I probably told about 25 or 30 jokes. About 6 months ago, I started, for a number of reasons, mostly my reading in preparation for today, I started to regret that I had done that presentation. I started to regret it, and then I had already told the executive director that I would do this again, and I was a little hesitant to change my mind and go back on my acceptance. And then all of this happened in the Mideast, and that really settled for me that this was not an appropriate thing to do. And things are different from 5 years ago, and they're certainly different from 3 months ago. So that was the decision that I made. Brett, you can show them that first slide. Let me tell you something about that, and that'll get me into my topic for today. The first thing I showed was, I can't walk away, can I? The first thing I showed or I talked about was the fact that my wife, Mary Ellen, had done Ancestry.com, and she had found that she had a number of places that her family had been from. And I thought, well, I'm going to do that too, because I'm sure that I also kind of a Renaissance guy, you know, I can all kinds of different things. And then when I got this in the mail, it said 99% Jew. This is interesting. This is interesting. What's that? It really did. Well, I'm explaining. It actually said 99% Jewish. But I thought, and now I regret that, I thought it would be funnier if it said 99% Jew, which it was funnier because I got a huge laugh. But what's interesting about this is that both the Ancestry.com were avoiding the word Jew, but I wanted to use it because I thought it spoke to people who have some kind of, you know, feelings about this that they may not express, but they know what the word Jew means and what the connotation is. I am not saying that all Jewish jokes are bad. That is not true. In fact, one of the points I tried to make in my presentation, that Jewish jokes, many of them are filled with wisdom. In fact, they're not even jokes you laugh at. I told all my audiences that if you feel a joke is full of wisdom and insight, you don't have to laugh, but you can applaud. And I got a lot of applause because a lot of the jokes are perfectly okay. But there was a problem, because some of the jokes were a fostering of the stereotype, which I now realize you do when you tell some but not all Jewish jokes. So I'd like to show you, by the way, I want to repeat a story that I told 5 months ago. Brett, can you show my rabbi? Okay. This is me. I want to walk away. This is Rabbi Shankman. Rabbi Shankman married my mother and father. That sounds like a threesome, doesn't it? What is that? That's really strange. He was a Reformed Jew. Oh, can I use that? See, I have never worked with microphones. Okay. Rabbi Shankman was a Reformed Jew, and I was a member of his temple. And the story I told during Fringe, which is absolutely true, but it has an interesting result that I'm going to share with you, is that he came into our bar mitzvah class, and he said to the class, he was trying to show what I just mentioned, which was the negative thing about the word Jew. He said, who in this class would be willing to go to Hebrew University? And everybody, including me, raised their hand. And then he looked at the class and he said, who would go to Jew college? And everybody kind of looked down, and of course I raised my hand. And he said to me, Mr. Wolfsie, why would you go to Jew college? And I said, well, it sounds like it might be cheaper. Okay, now, be careful, because this is my point. I'll make the story short. He called me in his office, he put his arms around me, and he said, that's the funniest thing I ever heard, and he just kept hugging me. But you know something? If I had told that joke to an audience of mixed Gentiles and Jews, I don't think he would have found that funny. Because then it would have been a promotion of that stereotype that Jews are cheap. And that stereotype has a long history. I mean, Jews were money lenders. Well, I did a little research on that. They were money lenders because Christians could not lend money to other Christians, so they gave it to Jews, and the Jews gave it to the other Christian. So the origin of these stereotypes, which I will also talk about, is very interesting. So I learned that from Rabbi Shankman. Again, all Jewish jokes are fine. Let me just give you an example. I talked about stereotypes. Oh, no, I'm sorry. One more story, Brett, the grandmother joke. This is a great example of how people can misunderstand a perfectly great Jewish joke and misunderstand it and miss the whole point. So the Jewish joke is, and I'm going to tell it so you don't have the uncomfortable situation of having to laugh or not, but basically the joke is, and it's a classic Jewish joke, is that the grandmother takes her grandson to the beach, and while they're standing there, this wave comes and takes the little boy out to sea. And the grandmother looks up to God and she says, Lord, she said, if you bring him back just the way he is, I will be the best Jew in the world. I'll be kosher, I'll go to temple every Friday night, every Saturday morning, just bring him back the way he was. And with that, a wave comes and deposits the little boy on the shore. And she looks up to God and she said, where's his hat? Okay, now, it's a great joke if, because I ask people who are Jewish, why is that funny? And Jewish people say, because she had an agreement with God that he broke, okay? If you ask Gentile people, and this is not a criticism, and Gentile's not a bad word, I just want to make that clear, but a non-Jew, they will say, this is what they will say, because I did the research, they will say, oh, Jewish women are never happy. That's not what the joke is about. I am not criticizing people for laughing at it for that reason. I'm just telling you that when I tell that joke, it promotes that stereotype. And that's one of the reasons that I have decided not to do the Jewish humor thing, because I'm not sure I can separate the jokes that do the stereotype. I'll give you one other quick example. That is a picture of Jews with big noses. Look at this. This is a brief history of anti-Semitism, which after page 400, I realized it wasn't brief. So when I was reading it, so the nose, for example, is an old stereotype. And you're not going to believe this. I'm not making this up. In 1904, a group of people, researchers got together and they surveyed 4,000 people and decided the Jews didn't have bigger noses than anybody else. That's actually true. So where that stereotype really begins, no one knows. I read one tract that said that it started in the 1200s, but that's something that has continued to be a stereotype and probably isn't true. And later on, when I talk about whether Judaism is a race or not, I'll mention that once again. By the way, do you know this controversy? Do you know who that's Bradley Cooper and Leonard Bernstein. The controversy was whether it was necessary to give Cooper a bigger nose. Now, interestingly, his family was okay with that, but as you look at that picture, did they really need to do that? That's my opinion. I don't think they needed to do that. But it was part of the stereotype that they wanted people, in my opinion, in the audience to pick up on. So I thought that was just an interesting, a recent event, okay? Let's show the next one, Brett. This is my family on my father's side. And it's going to be very important that I make a distinction between my father's side and my mother's side. That's my dad on the far left. That's my great-grandfather, Hasidic Jew, and that's my grandfather, and of course that's me. I wish I had known more about my great-grandfather, but when this picture was taken, neither of us spoke any English. So I never, and I really do hate myself for not talking more to my grandfather. But let me tell you a little bit about these people, because I think it's interesting and speaks to one of the things I want to talk about. David, my great-grandfather, was born in Ukraine. Well, I'm not sure where he was born, but he ended up in the Pale of Settlement. Do you know what the Pale of Settlement is? That's where Russian czars play, that's where the expression comes from, beyond the Pale. Jews were placed in this area, which was in the Ukraine, Western Ukraine, where it was really, I don't mean this to be funny, but it was concentration camp light. I mean, things were pretty bad. So my great-grandfather, who was a Hasidic Jew, had a couple of choices about what he wanted to do. He could have stayed there, which would have been somewhat unbearable. His other choice was to emigrate to the United States, where ultimately almost 2 million people did, most of them Jews, came to the United States. The other option that he had was to go to Israel, okay? That was another option he could have taken. I don't know what was really totally available to him, but that's what many people like my grandfather had that option to do. This is when rising anti-Semitism was in Europe. Rising anti-Semitism, and Israel was an option for people to go at that time. I keep saying that, more about that later. So my grandfather chose to come to the United States. His son, my grandfather, was about 8 or 10 years old. My grandfather had an amazing life, really. He came and worked in the garment district as a young man. He bought a knitting machine and started making ties on the corner in downtown New York, and that's when he was, I'm told, when he was 16. By the time my grandfather was 40, he owned the second largest sportswear company in the world. And one of the things I'm going to talk about later, I'll talk about it now, is one of the reasons anti-Semitism grows with people is jealousy. This is a man who had nothing. My great-grandfather, as I said, never learned to speak English. I'm not sure my grandfather could read. See, I don't remember that. I never saw him reading a newspaper or a book. And I never asked my father, but it seemed obvious to me that he couldn't read. But he made a great success of himself. So, what other things have happened? Well, my father, interesting story, my father was a major in the Marine Corps in the South Pacific. He was in 2 battles. He got the Bronze Star. He was never hurt in battle. He was hit in the head with a brick that cracked his head open when one of his fellow officers found out he was a Jew. Isn't that something? Very ironic. Okay? So there was anti-Semitism there. Now, the question is, which slide are we on, Brett? I'm sorry, I can't see it from here. Oh, we're on the family. Okay, I'll put this one in and then get back to it. Is that the next one? Okay. In my life, oh, that's right, go to the next one, Brett. In my life, I have not experienced great anti-Semitism, but I've seen, how we talked about with the black population, microaggressions, okay, tiny things that happen. They've happened to me. When I was in college, I've told this story so many times, my wife could probably tell it. I'm in my room at George Washington University, and there's a knock at the door. And I go to the door, and there's a young man standing there. His name was Jim McHugh, I'll never forget. And he was from Wyoming. And he said to me, "Are you Dick Wolfsie?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "I just wanted to come by because I've never seen a Jew." Isn't that interesting? And I did not take that maliciously. He was honestly really curious. He thought, Brett, go back to the Moses thing. He really did think this, and this is a kid that got into George Washington University. He really thought Jews had horns. He really did think that, because I talked to him about it. That's, again, something that comes up through the ages. The root word for radiance is the same root as horns. So when Michelangelo painted this, he saw that Moses had horns. And that's how that stereotype, not the stereotype, but that's how the image got started. Let me show you some famous anti-Semites. One of them is really going to interest you. So that's Henry Ford up on the left, and Kanye West. That third guy, his name is Wilhelm Marr. He was the person who invented the term anti-Semite, which ironically, first of all, it makes no sense because Semite means desert, but he invented it because he thought anti-Jew was too harsh, but he still was anti-Jewish. So he invented the word anti-Semitic the end of the 1800s, and that's the word that has stuck. Interestingly, there's actually a debate about whether you should hyphenate anti-Semitic. It's not that we don't have enough things to think about, but I read 20 pages about whether you should do that. Okay, what do we got left here? Who knows the far right? Who knows who that is? Anybody? I know Mary Ellen does. Who is it? Coco Chanel, very, very famous, if that's the word, anti-Semitic. Who's that? Mel Gibson? Adolf Hitler? Who knows who that is? No, but I'll get to him. Oh, that's on the far right, Garrett, that's right. And one next to him is Richard Wagner, the musician. I don't think anybody knows who that is in the far left. Beautiful woman. Anti-Semitic. It's my mother. It's my mother. My mother was, I may be phrasing this a little strongly, a self-hating Jew. You can't believe how thrilled she was when I married Mary Ellen. She was afraid, truly afraid, that I was going to marry somebody who was, and I'm careful with this word because I have to explain it later, who was ethnic. We lived in a largely Jewish area, but we were mostly Reform Jews, progressive Jews, but Orthodox Jews would walk by our house on the way to temple because they couldn't drive. And she was, I loved her really, but she was disgusted by that. Who are these people? Why do they do that? Why do they dress that way? Why do they do that? And it bothered her totally. And this is one of the origins of anti-Semitism. Because my mother saw the Jew as, I'll use the term that has been used, as the other. They were different. They were always different. They didn't work on Saturdays. They didn't intermarry. They didn't eat certain kinds of meat. Everything about them was different. They were the other. And that's how she saw the Orthodox Jews who walked by. Now, at the time, I was 13, 14 years old. I didn't think much about it. But as I got more interested in this, and admittedly, I don't know if I said at the top, I'm an agnostic, secular Jew, okay? So I'm not a religious person. But once you're a Jew, you're always a Jew, okay? That's just the way Judaism works, okay? You can convert, and of course, we happily accept converts. I used to hear people say, well, I read that Jews didn't want people to convert. No, they did, but there was a period of time where they were afraid that converting was dangerous, that they would be ostracized and possibly in physical danger if they converted. So that's kind of a controversial topic, and I don't think anybody's totally sure what happened. Okay, so that's my mom. Again, I loved her dearly, but she clearly, now it's interesting because she married my father, obviously, and my dad had been a conservative Jew, but he was so much in love with my mother that he just gave up on all of that. He stopped going to High Holy Days, he stopped going to Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, and that was okay with my mother. And listen to this, we celebrated Christmas because my mother's family were German Jews, and there's a huge difference between German Jews and Russian Jews. How big is, well, the German Jews were generally more progressive, more enlightened. That's where Reform Judaism starts. People think Orthodox came first and then Reform. No, Reform Judaism first and then Orthodox Judaism. So what happens then is that my father marries my mother, decides not to be a Jew, or I'm sorry, not to be a Jew, but not to go to temple, and we celebrated Christmas. We celebrated Christmas. So you can see why she had an against Jews that were very religious, and that's actually too bad. Okay, by the way, I wanted to show you one thing. Some people, I don't think many people here are smart enough, might say, wait a second, Martin Luther was an anti-Semite? That can't be. Should we show the quote there? How's that for a quote? The Jews are brutes, the synagogues are pigsties. Why pick pig? I don't know. That seems like an odd decision to make. They ought to be burned, for Moses would do it. They drag and mire of the divine words. They live in evil and plunder. They are wicked beasts that ought to be driven out like mad dogs. That's Martin Luther, okay? Incredible story. And obviously much more to it. Okay. Now I'm going to start talking about, I think, what you thought the whole thing would be about. I have a very good friend, a couple that we are friends with. He's not here today. But he asked me so many times when we would have dinner together, why do people hate Jews? He couldn't understand that. And there has never been a time in history that there wasn't anti-Semitism somewhere in the world, and many times, many places in the world. So let's take a look at some of the things. By the way, here are all the places that the hatred comes from. I think you all know that where it's coming from now is not the far right, which was the original fear, but the far left. You've read about the universities and what's going on there, and university students are proclaiming sympathy for the Palestinians. That's fine, that's not the purpose of this presentation, but I want you to know that's an interesting place from where it comes. Obviously, it comes from all these other places as well. And I'm going to get to anti-Zionism in a moment because it's obviously important right now. But it comes from the ancient world. It was purely religious. You're a Jew, you're the other, you're different, we cannot accept you. The interesting thing about that is that ancient world was reacting to what Judaism was, which was promoting something called ethical monotheism. This is a really, really huge beginning of something. Because prior to ethical monotheism, there were pagans, there were cults, all that kind of stuff. But the premise of ethical monotheism is that not only is this about belief, which of course is important, people want to believe in God, all that kind of stuff, but it's not just belief, it's not just faith, it is in fact more than that, it is creed, it is creed. I think most of you might not know this, but obviously we have 10 commandments. Some Orthodox Jews oppose the 10 commandments because they think what the 10 commandments do is put all of the things in the Bible that puts the 10 commandments above other things in the Bible. There are 615 mitzvahs in the Bible. A mitzvah is something you should or shouldn't do. And scholars went through the Old Testament, that's really not the right word, the Jewish Bible. They went through the Jewish Bible and they picked out all the do's and don'ts, and there were over 600 of them. Then we have the 10 Commandments. Who knows what really happened, but the point is that the Bible, the Jewish Bible, contains 600 do's and don'ts. It'd be really hard to keep that straight in your head on a daily basis, wouldn't it? So Judaism was about creed and belief. Next one. Oh, I'm sorry, Brett, go to the next slide. Okay, so that's the first one, ethical monotheism. Being the chosen people. Boy, has that been controversial. What does that mean to be chosen? Well, I tell you, the last 6 months I've read so many essays discussing what it means to be a chosen people. It is a question about who chose who. Did God choose the Jews? Did God choose the Jews not because they were special, not because they were special, but he wanted God to spread the word of ethical monotheism. That's why he chose the Jews. Now, at the risk of telling a Jewish joke, but this is one the rabbis used to tell, that God was trying to promote these commandments, and he went to several groups of people, and it was a lot of thou shalt nots. And all the groups said, nah, we don't want that. We always steal, we always commit adultery. We always do this, we always do that. So then God finally went to Moses and said to Moses, this is what the commandments are. And Moses said, well, that sounds pretty good. He said, that sounds great. He said, how much are they? And God said, well, they're free. And Moses said, okay, we'll take 10. Okay? But you see, in that joke, and don't be embarrassed for laughing at it, but in that joke, part of your response to that joke, is it not, is your belief, or hidden or not, unexpressed, that Jews are cheap. Okay? So again, don't be embarrassed by laughing about that, but I want you to understand why I didn't want to tell that joke. Does that all make sense to you? Because I just felt with what's going on in the world today, to tell that joke was inappropriate. And I'm so totally happy with my decision not to do that, because I had known for a number of reasons that some of these jokes just wouldn't work. Again, I'm sorry to repeat this. Not all Jewish jokes. Many Jewish jokes are filled with wisdom and lessons. But some Jewish jokes, funny as they are in some ways, in a way, anti-Semitic. What's next up there? Obviously, I don't have to go through that. That idea of Christ, killing Christ, that's lasted forever. It still lasts today, obviously. Was it Pope Benedictine who did the dispensation and said that the Jews were not responsible for that? But that lives on still today. Okay, we've already discussed their inclusiveness, the other, and their race. This is an interesting thing, which I'll bring up one last time at the end. But is Judaism a race? Well, look at how Hitler looked at Jews. For much of Judaism, wherever you were, there was always the option, in most cases, not all, that you could convert. And if they were discriminating against the Jews, you could say, okay, I'm not a Jew anymore, I'm a Protestant or I'm a Catholic. In Spain, they were called conversos. And there were tens of thousands of conversos, Jews who had stopped being Jewish and then were accepted by Spain. So some of those people were really hated because it was like they had gone back on Judaism. Okay, wow. I'm going to come back to Zionism because that's what's in the news now. Socialism. Jews were fascinated by socialism. That's one of the reasons they wanted to go to Israel. The concept of Israel was not a religious one. It was not a religious one. It was a very secular movement. People wanted a place where they could go and just be safe. Okay? Sure, they might want to practice their religion, but it was not. In fact, it's so interesting to me. I was reading an article, and there was a copy of the, I just lost my train of thought, the Israeli Declaration of Independence, which was 1948, and there's no mention of the word God in the whole thing. They don't mention God. Going to Israel was a secular decision, and it was based a little bit on socialism, because the Jews felt that if they could live in a society that was more socialistic, it was more apt to be equally distributed, the wealth. And of course, as a result of that belief, they got associated with Lenin, and they got associated with Hitler. Karl Marx, okay, got associated with Karl Marx. So people were thinking that Jews weren't just socialists, they were also Marxians, and that probably wasn't true, okay? And let's go back. Boy, the Zionism is such a tough thing. The Jews, that's their homeland. I mean, we can argue this later if you want, but that's their homeland. And they occupied that land in one way or another for 3,000 years. The question that people keep asking is, if you're anti-Zionism, are you anti-Semitic? Do you hate Jews? In my opinion, talk about this if we have a talk back, I think that is true. But Zionism was an attempt for Jews to find a place to live and to be safe. Ben-Gurion said, this is a quote from Ben-Gurion, "I want a place where there are plumbers, bartenders, policemen, and prostitutes." That's what he said, because he just wanted a real country. That's what he was looking for when they established Israel. So Zionism, now it's interesting, there were some Orthodox Jews who wanted, not Orthodox Jews, some Jew haters that wanted Jews to go to Israel, got them out of the way, got them in their little place to live. So that was one option. Orthodox Jews, very interesting, Orthodox Jews are against Zionism because they feel it's not something the people should do, but it's something that God should do. That's what they felt, okay? So there's a distinction there. But when you think about it, and this is my belief, because I'm trying to separate the policy, I'm getting into the politics, I'm trying to separate the policy of Netanyahu from the whole issue of whether Jews should have their own homeland. So obviously that's something we can talk about later. But Zionism remains an issue. Israel represents 1/400th of the total area surrounding them of Arabs and Muslims. 1/400th. You can see why they're scared. Okay, even though if you don't agree with everything that's happening, you can see why they are scared. Okay, I think I've gone through why, did I miss one? Oh, jealousy. Oh no, let's go back. Oh, what happened to jealousy? Oh, their success, that's the last one. I won't go through the statistics and bore you. Jews traditionally have had higher education, they've had less divorce, they've committed fewer crimes, they, in virtually every category. More percentage-wise Nobel Prize winners, right? More Pulitzer Prize winners. And I'm going to read you a quote from Thomas Sowell. Oh, I just hope I can find this real quick, because I must have done something with it. Hold on. Oh, this is Thomas Sowell, great African-American black writer. And he was asked, when he was discussing discrimination against blacks, he was asked, what do Jews have to do to stop being hated? I just love this quote. "I think Jews succeed in a way that is a threat to the egos of other people. So what can Jews do to help themselves to end anti-Semitism? They need to fail. They need to fail, okay? But Israel is a place where not only Jews are succeeding, but where they refuse to fail." That's a very interesting thing. And I think, I don't know what your gut tells you, but I feel, again, as an agnostic, secular Jew, I do feel that there's a certain amount of jealousy out there. I mean, obviously the Jews have put a tremendous emphasis on education and on reading, and that makes itself clear in what's happening in society. Okay, Brett, we can go on. I just thought this is just not fun, but look at all the things that Jews have been blamed for. Do you know what blood libel is? Blood libel was the belief that Jews were taking Gentile children, killing them and using their blood for various, not activities is the wrong word, rituals, for various rituals. So they were blamed for that. They were blamed for World War II. The bubonic plague was clearly because of the Jews. Replacement theory, I'm not going to spend any time on these. They were blamed for the stock market crash. Elders of Zion. Let me just tell you about that. This was a book that came out in the early 1900s. This is not the real cover. Well, it's actually the cover, but it's also a book about this. This was an incredible book, which is still selling well in Europe. It is a book that maintains that Jews had a conference in Switzerland, and the purpose of the conference was to take over the world. It's totally made up. It was made up by the Russian Tsar, who was trying to protect himself against some other things that were happening. And it was totally made up. And it's just filled with things that the people who wrote this claim the Jews have done. It's still a bestseller in Europe. Anti-Semitism in Europe, sadly enough, is still pretty provocative. Okay, let's go on, Brett. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here soon. I timed this pretty well. This is great. I called a rabbi friend of mine in town, and I said to him, Rabbi, what is Judaism? Is it a religion? Is it a people? Is it a culture? As an ethnicity? And there was pause on the phone. He said, Dick, I have no idea. I have no idea what it is, because we really don't know what it is. We know what it isn't, or we know what it's more than. It's more than a religion. Now, keep in mind that Hitler thought it was a race. How do we know that? Could you convert from Judaism to something else and be spared Hitler? No, you could not. To him, it was a race. There's probably very little evidence that Judaism is a race, although it is interesting that obviously we come from a small group of people, but race is not being accepted by anthropologists anymore as a legitimate identifier. Obviously, people who are racists think that that is something that you can do, but probably isn't true. I mean, if you look at Jews, now remember, it's an interesting thing about Jews. If you look at Jews in different countries, and remember, while 40% of Jews live in Israel, 40% live in the United States, there are Jews all over the world. And this is, of course, because of the diaspora. When Jews were excommunicated from countries, they were looking for homes, and they spread all over the world. Just an interesting sidelight. Spreading all over the world was supposedly a punishment by God for how they had, after Moses came down with the 10 Commandments and they started worshiping idols and everything, that was a punishment. But the truth of the matter is, it's because of that punishment that Judaism is all over the world, because they spread everywhere. But it also results in the fact that Jews celebrate and worship in different ways in different places. So that's really important. Okay, so it's clearly more than a religion. It's clearly more than a religion. It's also a nation, okay? And that's what all this trouble is about now, because Jews see themselves that way. Ethnicity, another tough, that's why the rabbi said, I don't know if it's an ethnicity. Ethnicity is a combination of culture, of your habits, of your religion. It's a whole bunch of things. So, and it's certainly a culture. The most common explanation is that Judaism is a people. And I think that sort of encompasses everything. When they came here, in fact, I think I'm going to end with one quote, and then we'll be done. This is by Maimonides, who was a leading Jewish rabbi and scholar. From the very founding of Judaism, the Jews were meant to be a people and not just a religion. When the Jews were slaves in Egypt, when they gathered at Mount Sinai, when they traveled through the desert and entered the land of Israel, they were called the nation of Israel and the Israelites. They had a king, a legislative body, a unique set of laws and culture. Whether an individual Jew decided to accept the axioms of Jewish religion or not, whether they believed in God or were atheists, if they were born into or converted into Judaism, they were considered a member of the Jewish people, and people is underlined and highlighted. I hope I've given you something to think about. I wish my friend were here because he wanted to know why people hate Jews, and I think I've sort of addressed that. I'm not a person who prays a lot, but I do pray that things can find some solution in the Mideast, and I'm sure all you do. Thank you very much, everybody.